All right, Kim, what's on your radar this morning?
Well, we've been talking a lot here in the U.S. about vaccine mandates and hesitancy, but I want to show you what's been going on around the world that hasn't been getting any real coverage here in the States. In numerous countries, thousands upon thousands of people have been protesting vaccine mandates and passports. I want to show you some footage. Here in Italy, thousands of people have been protesting the country's Green Pass. The pass requires either proof of vaccination, a negative test within the past 48 hours, or proof of prior infection within the past 6 months. Now, this is for any and all international travel, indoor restaurants, theaters, and gyms. In early September, it was extended to long-distance train rides, buses and ferries, domestic flights, and parents entering schools. Now it's been extended to every single worker in the country of both private and public businesses. At times, the protesters have turned violent as they've stormed the headquarters of Italy's largest labor union. The protesters then headed towards the prime minister's office, where they were met with water cannons and tear gas. Nancy Pelosi actually happened to be in Rome visiting the country's leaders when chaos from the protests broke out. And the speaker and her husband actually had to be whisked from a church that they were visiting to safety. Even Jared Leto, who was in Rome for his band, 30 Seconds to Mars, he says that he was accidentally tear gassed by the police. Now, these protests have been going on for weeks. Now, in Italy is showing no signs of letting up, despite the fact over 80% of the population is vaccinated. In Switzerland, people must show a COVID certificate, which grants a person access to indoor bars, restaurants, large gatherings, including weddings and train rides, and even checking into some hotels if they've been fully vaccinated. You can show a recent negative test, or you can show prior infection. For the past 6 weeks, thousands of Swiss citizens have taken to the streets to protest the mandates, while police have shot off water cannons and rubber bullets. Amsterdam has seen widespread protests, with people carrying signs that read, "QR is going too far" and "Unvaccinated lives matter." Reports say some protesters were even displaying faux gallows. The Netherlands has implemented a COVID pass that restricts Dutch citizens from entering restaurants, bars, and other select indoor spaces unless they show their pass. And the Dutch government was going to require the pass for even outdoor dining terraces, but the pushback over the past couple of months has caused them to scrap those plans. Israel sparked widespread protest after the country announced their third booster shot is required for their Green Pass to be valid. In order to be considered fully vaccinated and allowed into most indoor venues, Israelis must show proof of 3 shots or show proof of 2 doses within the past 6 months. Once 6 months have passed from the second dose, a person must get the third or their pass becomes inactivated. France has been seeing nonstop protests for some time now, even before COVID, when yellow vests took to the streets every weekend for months on end. Now the protests are over vaccine mandates, which require people to show a COVID passport to enter any restaurants, cafes, other indoor venues, and even ride public transportation. Luxembourg citizens protested their version of a COVID pass in what they called a marche blanche, where protesters were dressed in all white, carrying white balloons. The new mandate, which takes effect November 1st, excludes the ability to test negative using a low-cost at-home test. Instead, citizens will be required to show either proof of vaccination or get tested professionally at a facility. And the pass is necessary to enter any indoor venues, such as restaurants and bars. Thousands of Greek citizens have been taken to the streets for the past few months to protest the country's COVID passports and mandates. Some healthcare workers are required by law to be vaccinated, and Greek citizens who are fully vaccinated are issued freedom passports, which allow them unrestricted access to anywhere they want to go. The Minister of Health said the goal was to protect the vaccinated, but also to protect the unvaccinated, who are much more at risk. Romanians have also been protesting against COVID passports. Thousands of people took to the streets in a massive display with signs that read, "Freedom without certificates." Slovenians were met with water cannons during their protests. Thousands of people are angry over their country's vaccine passports to enjoy a normal life. And Australia, well, Australia is a whole other story. I could do an entire segment on just what's been happening there. But the long and short of it in regards to protests is people are not only targeted with water cannons and rubber bullets, but their police are actually beating them with batons, and they're being met with other violence. It's quite insane what's going on in Australia right now. But here in the United States, leave it to the New Yorkers to express their outrage. The city implemented a strict digital COVID passport system for those fully vaccinated and for those who have tested negative. Unlike the countries in Europe, New York City will not accept proof of previous infection. People need to show the digital pass in order to enjoy the, quote, spoils of the city, as Mayor Bill de Blasio put it. Essentially, if you want to enjoy any entertainment or dining in the city, you need to show the pass. So it's really interesting, all of these protests that have been going on around the world. We haven't really seen these in the news much, but I mean, they are massive. We are talking in some countries, hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets to protest either the mandates or the passports of some kind. So, I mean, it's just been an overwhelming showing. And it's interesting how here in the U.S., we're really only seeing a massive showing in New York City. We've seen smaller protests, like Olympia, Washington had a little protest. Even here in Los Angeles, there's maybe one little one outside of the mayor's house. But for the most part, the U.S. hasn't seen these huge uprisings like what's been going on in Europe, besides New York City. I mean, why do you think that is? I mean, because, Americans are known for being freedom-loving, and a lot of people want to say, it's all these right-wing, far-right people. But where are they in the U.S. compared to Europe? I mean, maybe it's a different culture. What do you guys think?
It is strange, because you would expect that, you would think like, oh, the Europeans are going to be more willing to accept mandates than vaccine mandates than the U.S. But that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. Yeah, we did a segment here on polling that Hill Harris X had done, and some other polling about the number of people that supported mandates here in the United States. And the entire audience was like, fake poll. Mm-hmm. Impossible. Nobody I know supports mandates. This can't possibly be true. But yet here we are. I mean, hopefully the issue is losing some of its salience as pressure on emergency rooms reduces. Then there's going to be, I think, much less pressure on governments to push these mandates. But yeah, it is interesting. I haven't seen polling from Europe, but you definitely have a much stronger protest movement in Europe than you have here around this. Although Europeans do love to protest more than the United States.
Right. That's why I was wondering if it's more cultural. Because I know in France, when I lived there, every day you look. Yeah, they're protesting.
Yeah, and we've talked about this, but I think some of the polling has been disillusioning, but I actually think it's clarifying and important. I think the pandemic lockdowns have been, there's a portion of the American public, I don't know what size it is, I won't pretend to know what size it is, but I do know there's a healthy chunk of the American public that I think is increasingly craving more government comfort and more government control in their lives. And I think the pandemic has actually really conditioned a chunk of the American public that I'm completely uncomfortable with, and that frightens me, to be accepting, and actually not just accepting and tolerant, but to actually want to be protected from their neighbors and to be protected from all of these things that they're being told are terrifying, in some cases legitimately are very scary, from the government. The other thing I would say is the media is not covering, whenever there is a big protest like the ones Kim mentioned in New York, the media completely ignores them. It doesn't matter how big they are. The media does not cover these protests. And it's not covering what's happening in Australia either, despite the fact that a lot of the protests in Europe, really the reason that people are getting out into the street is to make sure that their countries don't turn into what's happening in Australia. And you'd think the American media would care about that, but I think it's very telling that they don't.
Yeah, it kind of makes me wonder how comfortable are we actually with authoritarianism? As you mentioned, Emily, are we, as much as we claim that we're freedom-loving people, and as much as we think, well, the Europeans will just kind of do what is necessary and what is best for all because they have more social programs than we have here in the United States, it seems it's really an interesting dynamic to see here in the U.S. We are seemingly more comfortable with authoritarianism, and clearly Australia must be as well. Because what's going on there looks a lot like China. I mean, you would think if you were reading the stories coming out of Australia that you're reading stories coming out of China. Mm-hmm. And it's like, wow, that's Australia. What in the world? We all kind of think of, the outback guys that are wrestling kangaroos or something, and we think they're real rugged people. But yeah, it's just interesting, all the protests that are going on. And they've been going on for weeks, and in some countries months. So I'm sure they're not going to be letting up anytime soon.
Yeah.
Right. In Australia, in some places, you have to check in every 15 minutes, and you have to send a selfie. Yeah. And if they ping you randomly where you're supposed to be, if you don't send a selfie from there within 15 minutes, then you're in violation of the state order. It's really dystopian.
It's Orwell.
Well, and there, here, if you don't wear a mask, I live in Los Angeles, which is very, very liberal. And if you're not wearing a mask outside while walking your dog and, you're 30 feet away from anyone else, somebody will yell at you. But in Australia, the police will actually wrestle you down to the ground and arrest you. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's been in certain parts of Australia, not all of Australia, but it's heavier-handed in certain areas.
I keep seeing Ryan trying to make citizens arrests on people who aren't wearing their masks. It's really frightening.
No, I think these people wearing masks outdoors is just absurd.
Well, stop arresting them, Ryan.
Here, we do the cops' work here in the United States, whereas in other countries they make the cops do it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Kim, thank you so much. We will have more Rising for you after this.